Hello, everyone. This is James Song here. Nice to see you again. Welcome to this video. So we have another listening lecture today, listening lesson, and it's a lecture passage. So let's get started right away. So I'll play the listening file, listening passage, and start writing notes first. Okay, here we go.
Listen to part of a lecture in a literature class.
All right, so now we've talked about folk legends and seen that one of their key features is there's usually some real history behind them. They're often about real people, so you can identify with the characters, and that's what engages us in them. The particular stories might not be true, and some of the characters or events might be made up, but there's still a sense that the story could have been true since it's about a real person. That's a distinct contrast from the other main branch of popular storytelling, which is folk tales. Folk tales are imaginative stories that, like folk legends, they've been passed down orally from storyteller to storyteller since ancient times. But with folk tales, you don't ever really get the sense that the story might have been true. They're purely imaginative and so quite revealing, I think anyway, about the culture and the connection between folk tales and the culture, which we'll talk about. But first, let's go over the various types of folk tale and focus specifically on Norwegian folk tales since they illustrate the variety pretty well. There are, in general, three main types of Norwegian folk tales. One is animal stories, where animals are the main characters. They can be wild animals or domestic, and a lot of times they can talk and behave like humans, but at the same time, they retain their animal characteristics too. They tend to involve animals like bears, wolves, and foxes. The point of these stories, their internal objective, so to speak, is usually to explain some feature of the animal, how it arose. So there's one about a fox who fools a bear into going ice fishing with his tail. When the bear puts his tail into the water through a hole in the ice to try and catch a fish, the ice freezes around it, and he ends up pulling his tail off. So that's why bears to this day have such short tails. The second category of Norwegian folktale is the supernatural. Stories about giants and dragons and trolls, and humans with supernatural powers or gifts, like invisibility cloaks, or where people are turned into animals and back again into a person. Those are called transformation stories. There's a well-known Norwegian supernatural folktale, a transformation story called East of the Sun and West of the Moon, which we'll read. It involves a prince who's a white bear by night and a human by day, and he lives in a castle that's east of the sun and west of the moon, which the heroine in the story has to try to find. Besides being a good example of a transformation story, this one also has a lot of the common things that tend to show up in folk tales. You'll find the standard opening, Once Upon a Time, and it has stock characters like a prince and a poor but beautiful peasant girl. She's the heroine I mentioned. And it has a very conventional form, so no more than two characters are involved in any one scene. And it has a happy ending. And the story is presented as though, well, even though a lot of the actions that occur are pretty fantastic, so you'd never think of it as realistic, the characters still act like they resemble real people. They're not real, or even based on historical figures, but you might have a supernatural story involving a king, and he'd act like you'd expect a Norwegian king to act. Okay, the third main kind of folktale is the comical story. We'll say more later about these, but for now, just be aware of the category and that they can contain supernatural aspects, but they're usually more playful and amusing overall than supernatural stories. Now, as I said, traditionally folktales were just passed down orally. Each generation of storytellers had their own style of telling a story. But in Norway, before the 19th century, folktales were just for kids. They weren't seen as worthy of analysis or academic attention. But this changed when the Romantic movement spread throughout Europe in the mid-19th century. The Romantics looked at folk tales as sort of a reflection of the soul of the people, so there was something distinctly Norwegian in folk tales from Norway. And there was renewed pride in the literature and art forms of individual countries. As a result, the first collection of Norwegian folk tales was published in 1852, and there have been many new editions published since then. For the people of Norway, these stories are now an important part of what it means to be Norwegian.
Okay, how much did you get it? I'm pretty confident again about the notes I have written. So I will go through the notes with you line by line, word for word, and that will pretty much cover the whole passage in full as a whole, I'm sure. Okay. So the professor starts the lecture by talking about folk legend. So it's type of literature. Okay. And it's based on history and it's about real people. So some story may not be true, but you know, some other part of the story could be true because it's based on real people and it's based on history. So folk tale is very different compared to folk legend in that way. It's in contrast, the listening says. It's complete contrast because it's not based on history. It's not based on real people. So it's purely imagined story that passed down orally from ancient times, from long time ago. And yeah, although it's not real, the professor says it shows about the culture of the country. So in professor's opinion, you know, you can see culture through folk tales, right? So in this passage, we're going to focus on Norwegian folk tales, Norway, okay? So one specific country's folk tale. I guess to see what kind of culture the country, the Norway, has through folk tales, I guess. So there are three types of folk tales. Norway folk tales, Norwegian folk tales, okay? The first one is based on animals, right? It could be wild or domestic. And in folk tales, the animal type, the character can act like human and animal at the same time, simultaneously. So could be bear, wolf, fox, these kind of animals that act like humans and act like animal at the same time. So the point, like objective goal of this type is to show the feature of animal. So for example, you know, fox took bear to ice fishing and bear put the tails in the freezing water and tails came off from the bears, okay? Yeah, imaginatory story, obviously. Imagined story, probably not true. And this is why bears have short tails. So that's first type, okay? Animal type. And it shows the feature of the animal. How did they get that feature? So for bears, they put tails in freezing water and tails came off. So that's why they got the short tails. Okay, pretty cute, I think. The second type of the Norwegian folktale, Norway folktale, is the supernatural theme, okay? So definitely not realistic, okay? Supernatural. So it could be about giant or humans having incredible power, like being invisible, people cannot see, for example, or like a human transformed to animal and back and forth and come back to the humans, become animals again, and becomes humans again. That kind of supernatural theme story, okay? And you don't have to remember exact title. I think it was like East of Sun and West of the Moon or something like that. It was title of this second type of story, supernatural theme. And yeah, you have to know what you have written. So it's basically Prince, who is bear animal by night and humans by day. Okay, so it's this story is an example of human to animal and animal to human, back and forth, vice versa, transformation story as an example. Okay, and the professor said it has a lot of like traditional original style. Like it starts with once upon a time in the beginning of the story. It has a prince and it has a beautiful poor girl as main character, one of the main characters. So it's a very traditional, typical of folktale, right? And it's very conventional, like only two characters in one scene. Okay, it's not very different from traditional way of storytelling. Okay, and it has a typical happy ending. All right, so the beautiful poor girl marries a charming prince. Okay, Cinderella stories, right? But it's a second type based on supernatural theme, the main character transforming from human to animal and animal to humans. Okay. And quite an important detail here. It's a detail, but I noticed the importance when I was listening to it because it was a very distinct information. It said when it was describing second type, supernatural type, that it's a very fantastic events, like many stories based on fantasy, but so it's not real. It's not based on history. It's not based on real people. It's not, okay? So that's folk legend, right? Folk tales, very different from folk legend in that regard, okay? It's not based on history. It is not based on real people. It's a purely fiction. It's made up story, but it reveals the country's culture, okay? Why? Because although it's not based on real people, in the story, they act like a real people, although it's not based on real people, okay? So I thought it was quite a distinct information that I need to, notice, potentially questions may be asked based on this detail, right? So it even gives a further example, although we all understood, like, king in this folktale story, although it's not based on real king in history, it's just a fiction, made up character, not a real king, but in the story, it may act like a real king, okay? So it's not real, but it may try to act like the real thing. Okay, so third type, remember we had three types of folktales. It's a comical type. And it quickly said, professor in the lecture said, we'll discuss this later, all right? So there may be a very technical, detailed question. It's a question type that ETS often, use. So in the question, they may ask something about, what did professor say about the third type? Okay. And the answer may be, you may get more information later. Or even the question may ask, what information could professor discuss after the end of the listening passage? Then answer may be, he will discuss comical type in more detail. It's a very typical and technical tip. So if the lecturer says something about, we'll discuss that later in detail, then be sure to keep that in mind just in case, because it's one technique that ETS often use to ask question. All right. Okay, so let's continue. So third type, comical. Professor said we'll discuss more in later, so just keep in mind there is a comical type, okay? And it's usually more amusing than the second type, supernatural type. I mean, the name says comical, so probably, it's more funny, okay? And the stories just passed down orally, as we know, so it has its own style. So this is next paragraph. So almost like a conclusion paragraph, okay? It's not purely describing about the third type. So the folk tale as a whole just passed down orally, as already mentioned above here. So it has its own style, because I guess each individual, as it passes down, something gets added or taken out, or it's slightly changed. Before 19th century, the folktale was only for kids. Okay, they didn't see any other value than just to entertain the kids, right? But it changed. Yeah, so my triangle sign is being changed or changed when romantic movement started mid-19th century, okay? And, romantic movement felt that it shows the soul of the people, these stories, right? So revealing culture, okay? As professor said, it kind of matches how earlier in the passage, the professor said, folk tales kind of reveal the culture of the country, of the place. And later on, romantic movement felt that, folk tales kind of shows the soul of people, soul of Norway people, Norwegians. So increased in pride in these stories led to first published work. So folktale was published for people to read in 1852. That was very first time. And new and other publications follow after that. So, Norwegian folktales, Norway people, Norwegian, are proud about their own folktales, right? So now it's not just for kids. Now the folktales is important part of being Norwegian. It shows their identity. So according to the professor, what professor said in the beginning was right, that it shows the culture of Norwegian, right? So they're very proud about it and proud of it. And folktales are important part of being a Norwegian. Okay. Yeah. So that's pretty comprehensive. I think we got all the necessary information we need to answer any kind of questions that may come our way. So let's look at the questions and get them right. All right, so let's look at the questions. Question 23. What is the lecture mainly about? Okay, A, the role played by folktales in contemporary, modern Norwegian society. Not really. It's not about what function, what role folktale plays in modern Norway. It's more about the overview of the folktales. Okay, so it's not really what role it plays in modern, current, present Norwegian society. Not really. The description, okay, of the major types, 3 types of Norwegian folktales. Yeah, it's basically a description. It's an overview, this passage, right? Overview of Norwegian folktales, right? The 3 broad types of Norwegian folktales as whole, right? So B looks really good. C, comparison of Norwegian folktales and Norwegian folk legend. Folk legend was just mentioned, and not even Norwegian, but folktale as a whole was briefly mentioned in the beginning, but it doesn't talk about folk legend after like first 2 sentences, right? It's all about folktales and specifically Norwegian folktales. So there is no comparison in this listening passage between folktales and folk legend as the whole passage. Definitely not. It's just, you know, first couple of sentences. So that this comparison is not what the this listening passage is mainly about as a whole. Definitely not. Okay, D, illustration of the differences between oral literature and written literature. Totally off topic. Okay. It's not, if you chose D, I'm sure you haven't, but if you chose D, that you're basically saying the whole passage is about comparison between oral literature versus written literature. Nonsense. So question 23, the answer is B. All right, moving right along, question 24. What does the professor find appealing, so attractive, okay, appealing, attractive about folk legend, not folk tales, folk legends. So what were the features of folk legend? It's based on history. It's based on real people. So people may identify and get engaged because some parts of the story may not be true, but other parts could be actually true because it's about real people and it's based on history. So people expect some of the story may be actually true about real people. So that's a real appeal about folk legend, not folk tales, folk legend, right? They're very imaginative, opposite of the answer. They are somewhat realistic. It's, you know, like a perfect paraphrase of this note-taking here, okay? Some part may not be true, but people may feel that the story could have been true because it's based on real people. So, you know, some parts may be untrue, but, you know, overall, so somewhat, not completely, not 100%. So somewhat includes this part saying that, you know, some part may be untrue is covered by somewhat, okay? So they are somewhat realistic. So they expect it could have been true, okay, overall. So that's real appeal. C, they stress what is important in a culture. Not true. I mean, C is completely wrong, but you know, not exactly same as C, but about revealing culture in this passage is folk tales, not folk legend. And question is asking about folk legend. So C is completely wrong answer choice. D, they show similarity. So there's no comparison here, I don't think, about folk legend. Just this is what's appealing. They show, so folk legends show similarity between otherwise diverse society, not mentioned at all. Right? So we don't know why even D is there. Okay, we don't get it. So B is the answer, and it comes from this part of note-taking precisely. Okay, it matches perfectly. It's basically the same sentence. So question 24, the answer is B. Okay, next question, question 25. How is the story of the bear and the fox characteristics of Norwegian animal stories? So this is from this part right here, right? Okay, so first type, the animal type that shows the feature of the animals, okay? And the story of bear and fox is this part here, okay? Fox takes the bear to ice fishing, and bear put his tail in the freezing ice cold water, and the tails gets cut off in the freezing water. So that's why bears got to have the short tail. Okay, so let's answer the question. How is the story of bear and fox characteristics of Norwegian animal stories? So probably this is the answer. Okay, the purpose, point. So the purpose, the point of the animal type folktale is to tell how the feature of the animal came about. How did it happen? That's the point. That's the purpose of this type. Okay. A, it explains the origin, so how it came about originally. Okay. Origin of a physical characteristics of animals. So physical characteristics here we can paraphrase as feature or features. Okay. Or physical characteristic can be paraphrased as the features as well. Okay. So origin. So how the physical characteristics or characteristics of animal has come about. Okay. So has come about can be paraphrased as origin. So A looks pretty good, right? B, it uses animal behavior. So bears, putting his tails in the water and cutting the tails off. So it uses animal behavior, bears' behavior, to explain human characteristics. No. So basically, this is the answer. Right? C, it shows how animals were domesticated by people. How bears were raised by people. Okay. D, so C is not the right answer, as you know. D, it contains episodes of animal changing into people. This is supernatural theme, right? So that's the second type of folktale. So it doesn't answer this question because the question is purely asking you to answer this part. And objective of this story as an example is to show how the feature of animal came about. Okay. So question 25, the answer is A. Okay, question 26. Why does the professor mention, okay, a folktale called East of the Sun and West of the Moon? So that is to exemplify, give supporting details to explain supernatural theme folktale, which was a second type of Norwegian folktale, and to as you can see in the note, I don't have to remember it all, to provide a story that explains supernatural theme story, which could be a story about giant or humans with incredible power, such as, or humans transforming to animal and back to humans again. So this story matches transformation story, right? Because it said prince who is bear animal by night, at night, and transformed to human during the day. Okay. So let's look for the right answer. It's choose two type of question. Okay. To point out conventions found in most folktales. Because this part from Once Upon a Time. So if you remember, and I actually told you this when I was reviewing my notes. So from here, the professor say it's very typical, beginning is very typical, like other traditional folktales. It starts with Once Upon a Time, and it's very typical. Main characters include prince and a beautiful poor girl, right? As a main characters. And also it says it's very conventional, traditional, like having only two characters in one scene, not more than two characters in one scene. And it has a happy ending. So these two lines we have written as our notes matches A as the correct answer exactly. So we need to choose one more. B, to point out differences between animal stories and comical stories. Definitely not. We are just within one type. Okay. One type of stories, no comparison between different types. C, to give an example of, 100%. Okay, I explained this several times, right? They claimed supernatural stories, for example, like humans to animal transformation stories. For example, East of the Sun, West of the Moon is such story as an example. And the story goes like blah, 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 blah. So C is perfect. D, to give an example of a story published in first collection, we don't know which stories. It doesn't say East of the Sun and West of the Moon. This titled story, folktale, was included in the first collection of Norwegian folktales. We just don't know because professor doesn't say anything about it, right? So choose two answers. Question 26. Answers are A and C. Okay, question 27, next question. What does professor say about the characters in Norwegian folktales? Okay. A, they usually behave in playful and amusing ways. This is just about comical type, right? In comical type, third type is more in comparison, usually more amusing than the second type, which was supernatural theme. So A does not answer this question, because question is saying, what does professor say about the characters in folktales, right? So A is not the answer. B, characters, they usually behave the way that real Norwegian people behave. Maybe. So I told you this, right? It felt like important detail. It wasn't the main idea, it was a detail, but this part right here, it felt like the important detail because of this, I guess it really shows the culture of Norway. Okay, so it's fantastic stories, it's made up stories, it's based on imagination, imaginatory stories. However, although it's not based on real person, they act like the real people, although it's not real. Okay, so of course we are not talking about actual specific Norwegian king, but a king, the king in this folktale stories at least try to act like a real king, although we know it's not based on history or talking about the real king. In the story, the king act like the real thing. So I think B is the answer. B is saying exactly that. C, most are giants, trolls, dragons. The most are based on, this is exactly opposite. Okay, they are not based on histories. Okay, and C is only talking about supernatural theme, so it does not answer the question either, right? So 27, answer is B, and it came out from this part of the note-taking precisely. Okay, so this part is answered, used to answer this question, and exactly the same as answer choice B. So question 27, B. All right, we have made it to the last question of this section, this listening passage set. So let's go. Question 28. What does the professor imply? So inference question. Happened as a result of romantic movement. Okay, so it's this part here. Before romantic movement. So romantic movement changed all that. What has romantic movement changed? Before 19th century, so until the end of 18th century, the folk tales were only for kids. Okay, they didn't see any other values of the folk tale. It was just for kids' entertainment. But by mid 19th century, romantic movement changed all that. Okay, and it put a lot of pride in the Norwegian people about these stories, these folk tales. So it ended up being published, okay, in 1852. Okay. All right, so children's literature became less popular. No. So romantic movement spreading to Norway resulted in what? Attempts were made to modernize the plot. No. If you choose B, you're basically saying romantic movement led Norwegian to modernize, change and modernize the story. Okay, makes no sense. Not mentioned. C, folktales began to be regarded as an important aspect of Norwegian culture. This part here. Okay, so before it was only for kids, but romantic movement changed all that. It was published, and it put pride in Norwegian people. And finally, folktale became important part of being Norwegian. And what was the first point, the trigger point that changed all that? Romantic movement, as we have written in our note-taking. Okay, so romantic movement changed all that, okay, led to this outcome. So C looks as the perfect answer. D, folktales in Norway became more similar to folktales from other parts of Europe. I want to know, I mean, folktales from or of other European country is not even mentioned, not even one. So I want to know, but there is no information in this listening passage. Okay, so it's done now. Last question of this passage, question 28. The answer is C.